Well, most of these clocks tell me that it's 7:30 and time for us to begin. We never know for sure which ones to believe. Let me welcome you all, including welcome you on behalf of the Environment Committee and our chair, Bill Roach. I'm delighted to be introducing Emily Moore. Emily is the Director of Climate and Energy Programs at Sightline Institute. Sightline, most of you probably already know, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and policy organization helping Cascadia to build strong communities, a green economy, and a healthy environment. Ms. Moore leads Sightline's research and policy advocacy in transitioning Cascadia, our whole Northwest region, away from fossil fuels and toward cleaner energy sources, a challenge she has focused on for a number of years. Emily earned her master's in public policy from the Kennedy School at Harvard University and a BA before that from Brown University. She lives in Seattle, where she spends her time e-biking around town, chasing her toddler, almost 2-year-old daughter, and marveling at our mountains. So, Emily Moore, can the grid keep up? Data centers, clean energy, challenges and opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you everyone for inviting me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I came a couple of years ago, so some of you look familiar. It's nice to be back at Horizon House and talking about important issues here in Washington and the broader Northwest. As Jean said, I lead the Climate and Energy Program at Sightline Institute, where we research and advocate for smart policy solutions in the region. I think Jean and the Environment Committee invited me here because I wrote a report a couple of months ago about data centers, which are getting, of course, a lot of attention right now as the AI boom is happening. And talking about what that really means for us here in the Northwest, and especially in light of our climate goals and our energy systems. So that's what I'm planning to talk about today. And yes, as Jean says, I live in Seattle. I've been here for about 5 years. I've worked at Sightline for almost 4 of those 5 years. I'm originally from San Francisco, though, so not San Franciscan. And yeah, I have a 2-year-old daughter who is hopefully asleep by now. So I'm just going to start by giving a little bit of context because I think that's always helpful. Most of this talk will focus on Washington State, where we all live. And then I'll zero in a bit on data centers here and talk about some policy opportunities in Washington. I understand you may have some of your legislators coming maybe next month, so maybe this is a good tee up for that conversation. And then I'll leave some time at the end for questions, but if there are any clarifications that anybody has, feel free to raise your hand while I'm talking. Okay, so just to lay set the scene, I guess, we are in a moment in time where energy demand is predicted to potentially double by 2050. And so this chart is for the Northwest overall. Not energy demand, electricity demand specifically. Energy demand is actually, if all goes well, going to go down because we're going to be shifting off of less efficient sources of energy onto efficient electricity. But you can see this picture here shows just how much more electricity we're going to need as a region. A lot of the conversation in the headlines right now is about data centers driving this increase in electricity demand, and that's certainly part of it, but it's not all of it. So if you look at the blue bar here, for example, down at the bottom. That shows transportation. So as we electrify our vehicles and stop burning gasoline in cars, that's a big driver. Nearly half of the increase in electricity demand comes from the transportation sector. There's also a sizable portion that comes from electrifying buildings, getting off of burning natural gas, for example, for heat. And then a portion of this, that it's unfortunately they don't have specifics to data centers or the tech sector, but is built into here. So that's one big challenge that we're facing as a region. Yes, I see a question. Sure, yes. Sorry, the bottom is really small. So the red is commercial, the commercial sector. The darker orange is the productive sector. I actually am not entirely sure how they defined that. The yellow is residential, and then the blue is transportation. This is from the Clean Energy Transition Institute's analysis called Net Zero Northwest. And it's the 4 Northwest states: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. At the same time, and folks may be following some of the news about this as well, our hydropower output has been affected by a drought. This is a picture of the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington, which I had the chance to visit, I think, a couple years ago. It was quite awe-inspiring. And in 2024, the Grand Coulee Dam generated about half the electricity that it did in 2012, which was its peak. So that's hydropower is really the core to how we generate electricity in Washington. It's comprises more than half of our generating sources. And so we not only need to figure out how to bolster that supply, but also how to build more electric generating sources to transition off of fossil fuels. Is that the dams that you're talking about? Yes, the dams. Well, so we have to, that's another reason. I don't think anyone's necessarily trying to get rid of the Grand Coulee Dam right now, but definitely the Lower Snake River dams, and then there needs to be a plan to, of course, replace that. If that were to happen, replace that electricity with other sources. Okay, now this is just zeroing in on Washington State specifically. This is an estimate of how much generation capacity the state would need in order to meet our decarbonization or our climate targets. So let me read those colors out. This is from 2021, so it's a little bit old, to 2050, all the way on the far side of the graph. And you can see that hydro is the blue, so it stays pretty steady in this projection. But what we ramp up is solar, which is the yellow at the top, and then wind, which is the green, the bigger green. This is basically a model that projects how Washington State could meet its decarbonization targets. This is the energy that the electricity sources that it would need to generate. I'm actually not sure what that one is. I think that might be small scale solar, but I'm not 100% sure actually. Oh, that purple is offshore wind, which I don't think they have any. There's no offshore wind on that. Yeah, the DGPV, I'm not 100% sure what that one is. Some folks may have seen this report that came out from OPB a couple of months ago now that was basically showing how Washington and Oregon are lagging the rest of the country in building new renewable resources. So those two yellow bars are Oregon at the top and then Washington at the bottom, basically comparing to every other state in the country in terms of how much net renewable energy they've added each state. At the very top is Texas. So far and away has added the most renewable energy of any state, followed by California. Now, I don't think we necessarily need to be Texas in terms of how much renewable energy we add here in Washington or Oregon. Here in Washington, we don't necessarily have the most efficient wind or solar resources. So that's where the grid becomes really important, making sure that we expand our transmission capacity to be able to tap resources in other states that might be higher quality wind, for example, or higher quality solar. Montana and Wyoming have some of the best wind in the country. And so I think this is telling that we have not built a lot of renewable generation in the Northwest, but it's not like we should be trying to be as much as Texas. So take it with a grain of salt, I guess. Sorry. Yes. Well, yes. So that's the added context here, which I'm sure everybody is aware that the current federal administration is really attacking renewables, and in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits are set to expire by the end of the year for renewable generation. And so there's a big rush right now across a lot of states to try to make sure that projects get approved as quickly enough to be able to take advantage of those tax credits before they expire at the end of the year. So I know Oregon's Governor Kotek announced or released an executive order encouraging agencies in Oregon to speed up approval of these renewable projects, and there's talk of doing something similar in Washington. We're definitely running out of time. And so I don't want to paint only a negative picture, but we are facing a challenge, to say the least, in Washington. I mean, the good news is that Washington already has the cleanest electricity in the country in terms of carbon-free sources. So we have a head start on the rest of the country in terms of cleaning up our electricity grid or our electricity sources because of our reliance on hydropower, which is the most across the United States. But we have a big challenge in front of us in terms of how do we retire all of these sources. And then that's where data centers start to come into the picture, because even those models may not have fully incorporated the new expectations around data center energy demand or electricity demand, since that has just been changing so rapidly. Some of the slides I showed you were a couple years old in terms of the data. So let me talk a little bit more about data centers. And actually, I urge a little bit of caution around some of these news headlines about explosive electricity demand and how it's going to derail all of our climate progress. I am a little bit skeptical of that, maybe naive. We'll see how it all pans out. But just to give us, again, a bit of a lay of the land. So Washington has had data centers for decades. We have about 100 data centers in the state. That's about the same in Oregon. What's new, of course, is what's known as hyperscalers. So these are the really big data centers that power artificial intelligence or AI. That has obviously not been around for decades, and that's where the concern is around the big ones. But data centers are not new to the region. So I think it's always helpful to just keep that in mind. And then they also do consume a pretty small portion of Washington State's electricity right now. So I'll just clarify this chart. What it does at the bottom is list the top 15 states in terms of the percentage of that state's electricity that's consumed by data centers. And I've got in orange here, Oregon, which is about 11.39%, and then Washington, which is almost 6%. So the number one state all the way on the left, you don't need to read every state, but the number one state all the way on the left is Virginia. So that state, that's where the highest percentage of the state's electricity is consumed by data centers. Here in Washington, as of 2023, it was about 6%. So that's where I also just want us to kind of not overblow the impact that data centers are having. They are certainly a rising component of the electricity users, but they're still fairly small. And nationwide, data centers use about 4% of the country's electricity.
To identify the words data center.
Oh, sure. I probably should have put a picture. So a data center is basically a building that houses a bunch of computers, and it requires a lot of electricity to run, and it has basically just rows and rows of servers in it. And because of artificial intelligence's new the new capabilities that it has, it requires even more computing power and therefore electricity to run. So we've had data centers, so it's a physical, actually maybe I do have a picture. Well, this is not a very good picture, but it's a Google Earth image looking from above. This is in, where is this? Quincy. This is in Quincy. So you can just see the roof. This is just the roof of the data center. So it's just a big building, big box, kind of looks like a warehouse that has a lot of computers in it and requires a lot of electricity to run. But we need data centers for anything that you do online relies on a data center. If you watch Netflix or, do your banking, anything like that. But what's new is if anybody has used ChatGPT or any other kind of artificial intelligence, that's needs a whole nother level of electricity. Right, so there's really no great estimates for how much electricity data centers could consume. Some people think that this artificial intelligence thing is just a bubble and it hasn't necessarily proved its usefulness, and that projections for how much electricity the sector will use are way overblown. Other people think it could totally disrupt the whole energy system. So I just think there's so much uncertainty in terms of how likely people are to adopt the technology, how useful it actually is, as well as potential efficiency improvements in those data centers themselves, because they do get more efficient. They can get more efficient potentially. So I would just say the main thing my takeaway is that we really don't know. But right now in Washington, data centers are a fairly small user of our electricity, but likely growing, about 6%. Another thing that I think is sometimes missed in the news coverage is that our electricity consumption overall in Washington has actually dropped in the last decade. That's not only a little bit, about 4%. I think this is comparing 2013 on the left with 2023 on the right. And then in terms of the bars, you've got the residential sector at the bottom in the gray. You have commercial in the orange, and then industrial at the top. And then there's a teeny tiny sliver that you probably can't see that's transportation right now. But this is basically how the different sectors break down in terms of using electricity. And what you can see is it's basically flat. Still in Washington, we have not yet seen the situation that Oregon has seen, where its electricity demand has actually gone up quite significantly in the last decade, because Oregon is has become more of a data center hotspot than Washington has so far. And I should say there's a few reasons that data centers are attracted to the Northwest. One is the abundant hydropower. And the irony is that many of these tech companies, so Microsoft or Amazon, have, if they haven't yet abandoned them, hopefully, have climate commitments. And so they want to be able to use non-emitting power. And so they're actually drawn to that in the Northwest. Electricity is also cheaper here than it is in the rest of the country. And so that's another draw. And Washington and Oregon both also have enacted tax breaks for data centers to attract them. So there's a variety of, and then the other thing is that once some data centers are here, it makes sense for more data centers to come here. There's sort of a grouping effect, I suppose, because of the workforce components. So there have been really two hotspots in Washington for data centers, mostly driven by Microsoft. One is in Grant County and one is in Douglas County. And so I actually have some, so Grant County the Grant County Public Utility District has seen its electricity demand increase by 52% over that same time, that past decade. And Douglas County has seen its electricity demand increase by 74%. So you see these huge spikes, whereas the state overall is relatively flat. And I think there is a concern that data centers will basically cannibalize the hydropower for themselves, and then other sectors won't be able to use it. And that is a concern, though there are some limitations to the extent to which they can actually do that. So this gets a little bit in the weeds, but basically most of the public utilities are relying on dams that are owned and operated by that are operated by the Bonneville Power Administration. There's a law that prohibits selling that hydropower to any new large load customers, which basically means any new big energy users. So it's not possible for public utility districts that buy their power from Bonneville to then sell it to a new data center customer. Yeah. They're not big job creators, if that's what you're getting at. Yeah, the computers do just run on their own. I think there's some maintenance and there's construction that goes into it and some maintenance, but for the most part, my understanding is it's just sort of buildings of computers. Yeah.
Could we please hold your questions until the end, except if you didn't understand? Okay. If there's something that's simply clarifying words that she has already said, that's okay to interrupt. But we would like to hold questions with major content until we've had a chance to hear all of what Emily is planning. Okay?
So from a climate standpoint, I think the biggest worry is that with this potential rising electricity demand from data centers, utilities in Washington as well as in Oregon that were planning to phase out reliance on natural gas for generating electricity will delay doing so because they may run into resource adequacy issues, not having enough power, or run into cost issues. And so I do think there's a risk that we will see a slower phase out of gas. I've even heard some chatter that there might be discussion around weakening Washington's clean electricity law because of the increased demand for power, not just from data centers, from other sectors. But I honestly don't know how realistic that is. Okay, I'm going to share some ideas for policy opportunities, but I think the big headline is that we need to build a lot more renewables and a lot more electric transmission capacity, which is basically the grid, the wires that connect the renewables to where we use our energy. We need to build a lot more of it, and we've known that we needed to build a lot more of it before all of this discussion of data centers really popped up in the news in the last couple of years. So I do worry sometimes that I hear people say things like, well, don't we only need that to power the data centers? And that's not true. In order to transition our entire economy off of fossil fuels, like our cars and our homes, and our businesses, we will need more renewable resources, and we will need an expanded electric grid. One other thing I wanted to share, because I think sometimes I hear people say, well, let's just ban the data centers from the Northwest. I think there's a instinct to kind of, not have them here. I worry a little bit about that because I think it risks pushing data centers to places with weaker environmental regulations and dirtier power than we have in the Northwest. So if you believed that strategy could work everywhere and you could really, stymie the growth if you didn't want it, then maybe. But we're seeing around the country and other places that rely a lot more on coal for electricity than here, or again have weaker environmental protections, that the overall impact to the climate might be worse, as well as the direct harm to some nearby communities. So this is just a clipping from a news article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about Georgia Power's plan to build a lot of gas generating facilities in Georgia to meet data center demand, and that would not be possible in the Northwest. And so I have wondered, is there an opportunity for us to lead here in the region and show that we can power, if these data centers are coming, can we show that there's a way to power them with clean electricity? So 4 different policy ideas that I wrote about in the report that I mentioned earlier. So the first one, I'll just talk about each of them a little bit. The first one is something known as demand response. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this idea, but the best way that I think about it is, so I'm from California, like I said, and there was a moment maybe a year ago when the California grid was getting overloaded and everyone got a text message on their phone saying, power down your electricity, turn off your air conditioning. And they averted a blackout by just having people change what they were demanding of the grid. So this is sort of a similar concept where if the grid is getting overloaded for whatever reason, maybe it's a cold snap, we rely on electricity for most of our heating here in the Northwest, you could require data centers to ramp down or to shift. Most of these companies have a bunch of different data centers. They don't just have one. And so you could require them to shift which data center is powering on, basically. And the reason that is a good idea is partly because the way the grid is built is really only to meet the peak demand, which only happens a couple of hours a year. So you actually have a lot of space in the grid, and it's very rare that you'll reach that peak. So if you can avoid increasing the peak, you can avoid building out a ton of new resources and grid infrastructure. And Google actually announced that they will be doing something like this, pilot program. Not here. I forget where it is. Somewhere in the, maybe I have it in one of my notes. They're doing it with the Tennessee Valley Authority. And Texas, actually, to mention Texas again, just enacted a law, I believe last year, called SB 6, which requires data centers to participate in something like this. I know the Washington legislature is considering a data center bill this upcoming session in 2026. Not sure if that will be part of it, but I think it would be a good idea. So that's, again, basically requiring data centers to power down or shift their demand when the grid is stressed so that you can avoid overbuilding. Second thing is there's a thing called green tariffs, which is not to be confused with tariffs that are in the news right now. Basically utility tariffs, which are rates that a utility charges its customers. And there are ways that utilities can basically charge a premium for a green product. but they're capped. And I believe that we could remove the caps on those to basically allow data center companies, or rather the tech companies, which have oodles of money, they really don't have any constraint on how much money they can spend. They could, if we did that, invest in new generation sources that might be more innovative and therefore a little bit more risky that a utility would not be able to invest in, because a utility has to invest in the most prudent and kind of safe options, very risk-averse industry. But if they could partner with a tech company that could pay a premium, we might see some investment in some innovation that could then benefit everyone. So again, there's an example of this with Google and a utility in Nevada. They've struck an agreement that basically is allowing Google to invest in advanced geothermal, which the utility would not be looking into otherwise because it would have been too expensive. And then, if that pans out, that could benefit everybody potentially. The third idea is, again, kind of trying to tap into the deep pockets of these tech companies. One of the big concerns right now with data centers around the country is the impact on electricity rates, because there's concern that, if they require grid upgrades to serve the data center, so let's say a utility says, yes, we want this data center, but we're going to have to spend all this money to upgrade our grid system, that without smart policy, there's a risk that those costs actually get spread out across everybody else, not just the data center. So, you and me. Oregon passed a law this year in 2025 called the Power Act that basically makes sure that whatever costs are associated with a data center are only borne by the data center. Again, I think Washington is considering something similar this year. I wonder if there's an opportunity to go even further and try to get the data center companies to actually subsidize, pay more than their fair share because of their deep pockets. That's not a popular idea with the data center companies, but I think it's a good idea. And then finally, I mentioned that there are tax breaks in both Oregon and Washington intended to entice the companies to come here. Based on my research, I'm not sure they need those tax breaks to come here. There are a lot of other reasons that they're attracted to the Northwest. But if we're going to keep them, then it would be good to condition those on meeting some environmental outcomes rather than just having it be kind of a giveaway. Let's see if I had anything. I think the last thing was just to emphasize the importance of transmission in this whole picture. I kind of touched on this earlier, but the reason we need an expanded transmission grid is it allows us to access efficient, clean resources out of state. So again, Washington isn't necessarily known for our solar power, or we do have some solar and some wind, but not necessarily the most efficient across the United States. And so we can tap into other parts of the country that do have that efficient resource, which also, getting to the second bullet, makes it a far more affordable transition. A study from the Clean Energy Transition Institute found that decarbonizing the Northwest would cost $13 billion more by 2050 if you don't expand the transmission system. Because again, you're not able to, everybody's then building their own resources in their own areas, not sharing, not getting those efficiencies. And then also, this is more of a narrow consideration here in Washington, but it has become somewhat difficult to find places that are appropriate to site the renewable resources. There are several solar facilities under consideration in Washington that have a lot of opposition from local counties and residents. And, I don't know that this would definitely solve that, because there might be those issues in other states, but you would rely less on citing renewable resources here in Washington. There will be almost certainly a big bill that was considered last year by the Washington legislature focused on transmission that did not pass. It made it fairly far through the legislative process. It's called Senate Bill 5466. And the legislature will be reconsidering it this year. So that's something to watch if you're interested in transmission. What it would do is create a state transmission authority, basically a state agency that would have the ability to own and conduct public-private partnerships to build transmission lines. It wouldn't be the state itself going out there and, on the construction site. They would partner with utilities or other private developers more likely to build the projects. But right now, Washington is basically fully dependent on utilities and the Bonneville Power Administration to build the grid capacity. And this would give the state more of a leadership role in building those projects. Okay, that's all I had, but I'm very eager to hear any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Everybody's suddenly shy.
Yes, this one.
I haven't heard anything from you about the possibility of nuclear energy. That has also been bandied about in the newspapers, and I wonder what the scuttlebutt is about that.
You're right. That is a big topic of discussion right now, especially among the tech companies. And there's some chatter about building some more small modular reactors in Washington. My understanding, and this is not something I've researched deeply, but is that the timeline for that is no sooner than 5 to 10 years. And so we need to figure out something in the meantime, and that it's still very expensive. So none of the small modular reactors that we hear about in the news have actually been built yet. So it's still, even though potentially could be exciting if some of the promises bear out, we just haven't actually seen that happen yet.
Hi, Emily. Thank you. Last week, the Washington State Standard had an article about a, quote, green fertilizer plant that was planned for outside Richland, basically. And they'd lost their funding from something called a hydrogen hub. And the company, which is a Swiss company, AgroAtlas, announced it was going to go ahead with its plans, despite the loss in funding, and it was going to build a data center with the fertilizer plant. So would you comment on that, please?
Okay, I didn't read that article, so I don't know. I don't know. I'm not familiar with that specific example. But yes, the hydrogen hub, the Pacific Northwest, was going to get, I think, $1 billion for green hydrogen. I don't know. I'm curious. How did it say what the connection would be between the fertilizer plant and the data center? No.
Well, it was going to make money enough to build the plant. Okay. I mean, that's what I understood.
Yeah. I'd have to look into that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't know the details of that.
Thank you.
Someone else first.
Is it my turn? Is it working? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. I used to practice law in the area of electric utility regulation. And the reason that the data center that Microsoft built in Grant County is because electricity in Grant County was dirt cheap. It's right there by the dams. They don't have a big residential load. And generally, residential customers pay less than the actual cost of bringing electricity to them. So do you have a way of making the costs of upgrading the transmission system, which is in the billions or maybe even trillions, more equitable? If we just dump all those costs on the data center, they'll just build their data center in Virginia or someplace else. So how do you propose to distribute those costs fairly?
That's a good question. And yeah, I think that's something that the regulators are grappling with right now because, so the Power Act that I mentioned in Oregon, I don't know if you've taken a look at it, but basically it segments out the data centers from the other classes of customers, residential and commercial, to make sure that any grid upgrades that are kind of caused by the data center demand then fall on the data centers. It also has some other provisions that protect other ratepayers, in other words, the residential or commercial customers, in case the data center demand doesn't actually materialize. That's a really big concern right now, where data centers might show up to a utility, say, you know, we're going to build this data center here, we need all these grid upgrades, and then they actually don't show up, and then the other customers are left holding the bag. So that Power Act also deals with that. In terms of the balance between, you know, requiring the data centers or getting them to pay their fair share or more than their fair share versus being, over-regulating, for lack of a better term, and pushing them to another place, I don't know. I think that's a really tricky balance that Washington is going to try to strike.
Emily, I think you were here a while back talking about the problems of transmission lines, which are chiefly that localities don't want them in their neighborhood. And so how is this central authority, which I know has been a priority of Sightline, if it comes into existence, how is it going to handle that problem?
Yeah, transmission lines aren't very popular. Even though I have this picture from the beginning. I don't know if anyone knows this transmission line in Beacon Hill, which is where I live in Seattle. This is over the trail where there's a bike path, and I'm actually looking into this right now to try, because I think it's really nice. And there's houses right next to it. So I've been curious how these people feel about living right next to the transmission line. In any case, whenever a new project is proposed, there's a lot of opposition. The main mechanism that Washington has, it actually already has in place. It doesn't need the authority to deal with this, which is an agency called FSEC, the Energy Facility Siting Council. Basically, Washington created this body in the 70s and then updated it more recently, but it grants the state override authority. Obviously, you'd rather have people be bought in, and I think we have a challenge in communicating the benefits of an expanded grid because they are so diffuse. And we also kind of take it for granted. You really only appreciate it when it's gone. When you have a blackout, you suddenly realize the whole system that's been supporting everything that we've got going on. But in any case, so there is a mechanism right now for Washington State to override opposition for large transmission projects. But I think there's a probably bigger issue of how do we convey the importance of this, not just transmission, but also renewable generation projects, so that there isn't as much opposition in the first place. And that's a really tricky thing. Sightline is right now doing some messaging research, actually. We're going to be doing some focus groups and message testing to try to figure out better ways to talk about the need for an expanded grid and more transmission. And Probably unsurprisingly, there's partisan differences and differences across regions, rural, urban, all the usual divides. There might be different messages that resonate more with different people, whether it's the climate piece, which I talked about a lot about today, or the resilience piece, or the economic development piece. There's businesses that might need more electricity to operate and bring jobs to Washington. There are all these different angles that we're trying to better understand. How do we communicate?
I have a question over here.
So what is the justification for giving tax breaks to these centers when it's pretty well known that they don't actually result in many permanent jobs, which is the usual justification for giving tax breaks?
Good question. I think, I don't know honestly, but it is an economic development argument. Maybe it's a bit more of a vague one than the job creation, but that these are important companies in Washington. You think about Microsoft, maybe the data center isn't a big employer, but Microsoft is a humongous employer, and they are the biggest data center. They own most of the data, or they're in most of these data centers, these big ones. So my hunch is that those companies are advocating pretty hard to keep the tax breaks. Yeah.
Of course.
Go ahead, David.
So I didn't hear you use the word storage. And I'm wondering if there's policy related to that, because it seems to me, Washington has kind of coasted for a long time on hydro. And if Grant Cooley is putting out 50% of what it used to, the coasting is over. And obviously with renewables, unless you want to be dependent on the grid from generation from all the other states, you need to have storage. So is there policy that the legislature is working on, or that you're working on, relating to that?
That's a great point. Yes, there is, but it's not something Sightline has worked on yet, but it's kind of on the horizon for topics because of its increasing importance. And I think there are some storage projects being considered in Washington. There's at least one pumped hydro storage project that you may have read about. It's somewhat controversial. It is opposed by the Yakima Nation because of the siting. The siting is on a sacred land. So there, you still run into some challenges with that you run into with siting any other type of energy infrastructure. But I have not myself researched storage in depth, so I couldn't tell you specific policies that are being considered, but I'm sure that they are. And I appreciate the question.
So I'm interested in this proposed authority, and it sounds like there's actually something in place that the authority would be added onto or whatever. But do we have anything that's comparable, overseeing or guiding anything in Washington state infrastructure that would be comparable to this authority for sort of the grid transmission? Because, if there's a model that's already working on something else, I'm thinking versus you're trying to invent a wheel. What's some background that will inform, hopefully, the legislation?
Well, the main thing that the legislature is looking at is examples in other states, actually. So both New Mexico and Colorado have transmission authorities. New Mexico's was created over a decade ago, and then Colorado enacted a law in 2021, similar to the law that Washington's considering, that created the transmission authority there. And so I know that they're actively talking to the people involved in those. In terms of how it would kind of fit into the Washington ecosystem, I guess, it would, at least for the foreseeable future, it would rely on staff from the Department of Commerce. So it wouldn't require a really beefed up new agency. It would be its own entity, but it would rely on existing agency staff from, basically the biggest thing is that it would have its own board of directors that would have decision-making power over the decisions of the authority, and that it could enter into these partnerships with private developers to actually build transmission projects. That's the biggest thing. It's a good question whether there's sort of an analogous in a different sector in Washington. I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure, but I know the main model is the other states. Maybe, yeah. Yeah.
The Highway Commission comes to mind, just so people know what I said, with its pluses and minuses.
All overwhelmed? Well, thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you for being such an engaged audience.